Welcome to the Jeff and Alex podcast. I am Jeff Hillemeyer, and with my friend Alex Gonzalez, we explore topics that help you be your best self. And we also get to chat with some great guests. So join us now on the Jeff and Alex podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeff and Alex podcast. How you doing, Jeff Hillemeyer?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Alex?
Good. I've noticed every time we have a podcast, I have to remember your last name. So, it's good practice for me.
That's super easy to say sometimes. You nailed it. Actually, I should tell you, it's so funny. The first episode we did, my wife listened to it and she said, wow, he really says your name right. Because so many people don't. Yeah.
Okay. You know what? It's funny. I can't even connect what the mispronunciation of your name would be.
Well, most of the time it's the spelling where it
Is
should
it Jeff?
have
People say Jeef.
Right. Joffrey.
Joffrey.
Yeah, no, it should have two L's, but it doesn't. So.
Oh, so do people actually try to say Heilemeyer?
I have heard that. Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Wow, that would hurt. That would actually physically hurt. Well, good.
Yeah.
I'm you're in terms of our audience of millions, as long as our spouses are happy,
there you go.
We're in good shape. So
well,
good. Well, here we are still deep into October, into what's going to be the craziest and not craziest, but probably the most bizarre Halloweens here next week.
Yeah.
And of course, Jeff, last time when we spoke last week, I was all excited. Well, I was tired, if you recall, because we just finished the Braves. The Braves just lost Game 5, and I said, well, by the time this show drops, or actually the last show dropped, we'll be in the World Series. And as we record this, we are not in the World Series.
No.
United lost in another match in the 3 minutes of extra time, and I don't even want to talk about how the Falcons lost yesterday.
No, it's better for us to move on to bigger and better topics at this point. It's a sad time in Atlanta sports. Although you mentioned Halloween, which is coming up. Did I tell you my son, I encouraged him, but he created a Halloween quarantine website.
You mentioned, I don't know if we said it on the show here, so why don't you give it a plug?
Yeah, I mean, basically the idea being everyone's going to be trying to figure out what to do with Halloween. And, we were even doing that. And I told my 15-year-old, I was like, because I always wanted him to learn how to build websites. He's helped at 48 and 48 before. And so I was like, it would be interesting if you created a site with, 30, 45 days before Halloween, and maybe people will go to it. And so we'll put the link in the show notes. I think it's quarantine-halloween.com, but it's like 31 things you can do when you're in quarantine for Halloween. So I was proud of the little guy.
Oh, that's very needed right now. Cause it's, you have much younger kids. So I know this is, pretty essential. I mean, Halloween is as big as it comes for kids in terms of holidays. But so I know this is painful as a parent, I'm sure, in terms of, especially on a Saturday. Of course, Halloween's on a Saturday this year, everything that lining up, and who knows what the weather will be like. But, with older kids, it's a little less, obviously you have to worry about other things sometimes, but yeah. So anyways, we'll make sure everybody checks it out. Well, obviously what's kind of cool with your son too, is to me, it seems to me that he's very confusion tolerant. He didn't settle for the obvious. So here's a question for you, Jeff Hillemeyer.
Yes.
Which I just said correctly. How comfortable are you being confused?
Oh, how comfortable am I being confused? Wow. I guess I'd need to define confused.
So let's narrow it down to in a business. Let's put it even in, it doesn't have to be business context, but do you always, I'm sure you always seek clarity, but do you always go for the obvious answer when the problem arises itself? Or do you sometimes find yourself that you need to let something sit a little bit to get to the right answer? Where do you think you are in that spectrum?
I would say that's one of the biggest differences between the 44-year-old me and the 24-year-old me, is that I have learned to give things time to settle, to sort of understand. I used to be quick to pull the trigger, which can be a strength at times when you're building a startup. But I definitely, I've read about a lot of Lincoln and he was
Mhm.
very deliberately let things sit for a long time, let them play out. And I worked with another leader at Engage who was very good about that. So I think I've gotten better about it. I'm comfortable with uncertainty. I don't know, confusion sort of in my mind is maybe a little different, but I'm very comfortable with the idea that um, it's okay that I don't know what the right answer is, and it's okay that I don't see it clearly at this moment. So I think I'm a little confusion tolerant. Is that the word you use?
Yeah, yeah, and it's confusion tolerant. It's interesting because it's something that I started this, and I actually have a blog on this, so we'll put in the show notes as well. But I talk about this a bit, particularly when you talk about kind of what I call innovators DNA, what makes you innovative. But it's really to me a leadership attribute as well too, because so much fundamental to any leadership is about solving problems, taking different perspectives, and it kind of to me started until this whole aspect of I talked about this whole aspect of brainstorming and all that, but it's so easy. It's so easy in business, to get to groupthink. It's so
Mhm.
easy to also just find the quickest, fastest answer. And and we'll talk a little bit about the importance of also making the decision too, because this could also be a mask to delay decisions. But what I would always would frustrate me is that sometimes the most obvious answer is the worst answer, because if you could figure it out and instantly, can't your competition probably figure
Mhm.
it out as well too?
Mhm.
And so I started noodling around this aspect of confusion tolerance and how comfortable you holding competing on ideas in the same time, and can you
What
force those ideas to come together. So if you say the answer is here, introducing something that's competing and letting it swirl around your head in the same time, which by the way drives me crazy.
Mhm.
but
when
uh
you when
but
you were in big corporate
yeah.
in your past, I'm guessing the tendency was groupthink for sure, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, in groups, and I think so much of that is rooted in. And look, when you had like someone really senior in the room, there tends to be a tendency to kind of gravitate to how's this person going to react? How's
yep.
the most senior the person going to react? Which creates a weird dynamic of groupthink to singular think. You and I just talked about mentoring and coaching
Mhm.
last week, and that whole aspect of being more senior you are, the more lonely it gets, because sometimes you get false narratives and feedback back at you. That feedback is not good.
Yep.
And yeah, so groupthink, to your question, I think is very common in some cases in organizations.
I can't remember if we talked about this, but I got several years back. I got invited to a 2 day innovation summit at a large corporation in Atlanta,
Hmm.
and I would say maybe there were 40 people there. Maybe I was one of 10 people invited. The rest were 30 leaders within the organization. And we spent, there was a consultancy that came in from the West Coast. And, it was really actually great, engaging, 2 days. At the end of the 2 days, we had a list, like a whiteboard of ideas for how this business could, over the next 5, 10, 15 years, transform itself and so forth. And so there was this whiteboard of ideas, right? And then they went around and started to ask each person to tell which was their, sort of top idea.
Hmm.
Because what they said was, we're going to pick one or two of these to go after, depending on, who votes and how many votes each one gets. And I just thought um, that was a very poor way to end the 2 days, because there's some quote that says, like, groupthink is and coalescing around an idea is the enemy of innovation. And so when it came to my turn, I was like the 30th of the 40 asked which one. I just said, look, if it were me, instead of taking X amount of dollars and focusing on one or two ideas, I would take a sliver of that and focus on half the ideas. And then
Right.
from there, see which ones start to bubble up. But it was, what was happening was, everyone, as soon as a couple people said one or two of the ideas, everyone was going in that direction. Probably also because, the most senior person in the room was asked first.
Right. Well,
And so
yeah,
that person said
that
this
to me is
one,
a big mistake. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I just felt like,
Absolutely.
gosh, we had all these great ideas and they're going to die on the whiteboard. because you have to innovate and test and try. And it just, we were all coalescing, and it's like, oh man, that's not going to be the best way to end this.
Yeah, so I think that's right. So from a groupthink perspective, and you just mentioned the problem is the fatal flaw there, asking the most senior person for their answer. I mean, sometimes it's good to not have the senior person in there, get the people who understand what's going on to kind
Mm-hmm.
of bring the ideas up without risk of retribution or whatever it is that you fear. Sometimes it's false fears you have, but they exist. So yeah, I mean, I think it's about challenging groupthink, and also, I mean, I keep going back. The obvious is never original, and I think sometimes as a leader or if you're working a problem, you will get those conflicting ideas come at your desk, and then you have to work through it. And sometimes it's a little easier, even though it's tough. I think the most dangerous thing is when you get something that the answer seems so obvious, and it might be a big problem, but that you actually don't work at it, and you don't work at. So I think that there are times, you need to actually bring an opposing view
Yeah.
or bring a diverse perspective or introduce somebody, and that person that it's like, oh well, I know if I bring this up to them, they're gonna have, maybe it's you're in strategy and you're bringing in finance or legal, and they're going to bring in something that's going to slow this down. I think that's so important to get to the right answer. You can't do that for everything, right? There's certain things that operating your business, like the right thing to do is, if you have to send, billing out on the 25th, you send billing out on the 25th. There's certain things that are just routine.
Right.
But some of these bigger answers, you need to be comfortable making yourself uncomfortable, I think, to get to the right answer.
How do you, and because I've not worked in corporations,
Yeah.
how do you, how do you get people to that point?
Well, it starts with, I do think it starts with leadership too. I mean, and look, and as I mentioned, the more senior you are, the more important it is that you, I think, master this skill as well too, because you're the one who can invite so many different people into it. But so I think it's creating the environment of strategy, environment of constructive debate, and
Mhm.
it's an environment that allows different views to come in. And also having clarity on what the process is for decision making, I think, as well too, because to the earlier point, this should not be an excuse to delay for the
Yeah.
sake of delaying stuff. Like I can't come to decision, and I'm doing it because this probably isn't the right answer. There's a departure point. You got to get to a departure point. So I think creating that environment.
Mhm.
And look, I always put a lot, it doesn't matter how senior you are, a lot goes on you
Yeah.
because it's safer to have the safe bet. And how comfortable are you coming out and taking a little bit of risk going, well, what if we think this? Yeah, I use the term provocateur a lot, and I'm gonna write more about it. And it's an uncomfortable position in any organization, whether it's a big company or a small company. Because sometimes it's a smaller organization, it gets tougher because you have that very clear entrepreneur who's in charge, and how do you bring opposing views or conflicting view to it?
Mhm.
But I think that's part of this process is how do you introduce kind of colliding ideas to get to the right one?
Yeah, and I think the leader is the key. I remember I read a book that it was some sort of advice for a CEO type of thing, and the book made the point that when you're the leader in the room, in the conference room, let's say, you need to pretend that everything you say, you're standing on top of your chair. Everyone else is still seating, and you're on top of your chair, and you say it. Because even though you may not realize it, everything you say is just going to carry more weight.
Yeah.
And so holding back, like I've had I've had new people join my leadership team. I've had a couple of nonprofit leaders that I mentor join some leadership team meetings just to see how our meetings flow. And they always come back and say, I'm surprised by how little you talked
Hmm.
to me. And that's on purpose. Like I probably talked too much when I was younger, not realizing and wanting to weigh in and having an opinion. Of course, we all have opinions, but I really try hard to step back and let the team, before I weigh in. Oftentimes they'll get to either the answer I had or a better answer. But if I speak early, it's going to, again, it's going to affect things more. And I think that's a hard thing for a leader because you've gotten to that point
Oh
likely
yeah. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you do have good ideas and you do know
Yeah.
what's going on.
And you also act on your ideas too, which is where
Right.
at some points that's where the challenge becomes. And I can't tell you how many sessions, whether I was in a corporate role, particularly when I was running strategy roles, or actually when I was helping companies, where I would literally kick the CEO out of session, or where and so now I'm not saying physically I would do it in session, but
Right.
when we're planning it, it's like, okay, we're gonna have a strategy session about X, Y, Z, or a problem solving session. I'm like, you can't be in there, and
Yeah.
I'm going to bring you in, and this is your role. You're going to react because that's what your role is, and as CEO, is to be yes or no and make that quick, decisive decision and move forward. And then people feel confident and comfortable about it. But this uncomfortable aspect of it, let
Mm,
them be uncomfortable without you, because they're going to be more uncomfortable without you.
yeah.
And I think you're right, Jeff. That is so important, and for a leader, particularly a CEO, to do that, because your role does change a little bit, or quite a bit when you're in at that point.
Yeah, so I'll tell you another story. I think this is sort of in the same vein. Early on in Dragon Army, we started in 2013. We were a game studio, and we made 4 games before we pivoted to become more of an agency, which is what we are today. And the 4th game we made, um, I'm not a game developer or designer. I have no experience in that industry. But the team would create prototypes of stuff, and we'd play them and test them out. And then, ultimately, I thought I was clearly letting the team decide what game they want to make. So, but of course I let my wife, my kids play the games, whatever, and I give the feedback. And so we get toward the end of making our last game, Little Broken Robots, and there was a comment that was made or something like, well, hopefully the next game we'll make a game that we really are passionate about or something like that. I was like, what do you mean? I thought you guys were excited about this one. And they were like, well, I mean, we did it because you wanted us to do it. I was like,
Mm.
what? How did that happen? They're like, you remember you told us your wife loved this one? I was like, what? Like, I had no idea that I said that, and you guys thought, oh, well, this is the one we have to do. I mean, my wife's not the demographic we're going for. I was so like puzzled. And I don't know that there's anything to do with that other than to be aware
Yeah.
that even I mean, we were a small team back then. We were like 6 or 7 people and just every day working. And I just thought I was one of the team. And yet, because I mentioned that my wife liked that one over the other one, that's the direction we went. And that was a
and it,
mistake on my part.
and I tell you, it's amazing how quickly, yet subtly that happens, or that shift, how people perceive your role or it is your role, and that reaction to, well, we need to make Jeff happy. And it's not even an indictment on you as a leader or me. Or I remember going into, started running a business unit, and it to change the dynamic of everything, because it is isolating, and everybody is kind of reacting to you. And so I remember I would spend so much time deliberately making the stuff we just talked about, and I'll talk about a few points to kind of how to be more confusion tolerant. But how do we create those thinking sessions where people could feel comfortable? I know we had to practice it like a muscle, just like our operating
Mhm.
routines of having monthly, financial reviews and quarterly operating reviews. We would have quarterly strategy reviews, and that is when we pulled back, and I think you said it well, giving them a lot more time to talk and a lot more space and allow more time to debate. Because if not, I realize, and when you start getting into the action of everything going on, you're just, even me, who I consider myself highly confusion tolerant and embrace ambiguity, you start just boom, doing this, you're
Mhm.
going to do that, and then people start reacting to that. So I think that's a great perspective in terms of how important it is to realize how your team will start perceiving you in your role.
I find now, as we continue our friendship and relationship, but we're also doing things together more than we used to.
Yeah,
um I think that actually you're one of the most confusion tolerant people that I know, because as we even talk about the direction of this podcast,
yeah.
you're the one that is more likely to say to me, well, let's just keep doing it, and we'll see where it starts to end up, and we'll see what it starts to become, which I think is, but most people, I think, are paralyzed by the idea that they have to know what the goal is or what they're working toward. And I'll send you, hey, well, I saw this uptick in downloads or whatever, and and you're usually like, that's great, but we don't really know what this is yet. And I'm the
Yeah.
entrepreneur for 20 years. You're new to this part of it, but you seem to be more tolerant than me.
Well, and part of it's probably being, my natural. I find myself naturally confusion tolerant. I enjoy contradictions as well too. But it's funny sometimes it's being not to me the contradictions I talked about even as we get into this whole content world is I hate the kind of common advice of this is how you get more up. This is
Right.
how you do this. 'Cause I'm like, no, we're just gonna do it differently. And
Yeah.
so, but to that, I think it's important. You build teams is having that team that you have that person that will do that for you. Or if you understand that you are that person, how do you get that person to make sure you operate too? Because I
Yeah.
think you have to understand there's certain things you just cannot be confusion tolerant on. Or at
Mm,
least in the moment you can't be confusion tolerant on. You need to make decisions to make sure you make your numbers or whatever.
yeah.
But there's certain things and maybe it's competing for a certain account and particularly when
Well,
it comes for me, a lot of it comes when you start looking at strategy and how to differentiate and be unique. That's when the obvious can't be the right answer
yeah.
always.
Right. Right. And I was gonna say, like, a time when there was not a lot of time for confusion tolerance was like when COVID hit, and
Oh,
mid
exactly right.
March. At that point, I had to make decisions, and my leadership team had to make decisions, and we thought about it and we were diligent, but it wasn't. There was no time to wait weeks. So sometimes you have to act.
And although what I will say though is take the time element out of it. I will say during as COVID hit, I do think confusion tolerant leaders also were able to do well and thrive. The decisioning process had to be
Mhm.
really quick, but what happened was
Yeah.
everything you knew that was so-called normal was no longer normal. And I think good confusion tolerance muscles or being comfortable sitting in ambiguity and confusion also translates to making decisions in ambiguity and confusion.
Mhm.
Meaning, I'm going to make a quick decision on this. This all feels really uncomfortable, but this is the way we're going to move forward, and we're going to adapt to that. And so this is why I think there's different perspectives on being confusion tolerant. And I do think the biggest as I explore this topic, I think the biggest mistake is that it is a trade-off to time.
Mhm.
When it comes to strategy, it could be, and a good strategy is an evolution and doesn't happen in one day. But I think in a lot of the stuff you're talking about, and we've seen great companies, around here who've just have done some amazing quick pivots as COVID hit, and I think it was allowing to be like, wow, this doesn't feel normal, but this is what we got to do.
Yeah.
Um, so just real quick before we kind of start wrapping up here, I have kind of a few things I think that drives kind of confusion tolerant leadership, and so I kind of have a few points here and to get your thoughts, but one is um, you know, the whole just exercise of getting comfortable being uncomfortable, and as a leader, do you allow yourself to do that? And I just think leadership in general, and especially if you're driving change, but I think leadership in general, if you're always comfortable, I think you're always
Mhm.
going for the obvious. So that's one. Um, this is, I think, real important in terms of challenge your thinking style. And we've talked a little bit about thinking styles before, and whether you're highly analytical, highly creative, if you're, whatever it is, do you challenge it? So if you tend to be more into this kind of creative aspect, how do you bring numbers into the equation? If you're very analytical and everything's about the numbers, what if you bring some disparate thinking into the
Mhm.
equation? So I think that's essential to get to the right point, which some people would be like, but that's going to just slow me down, or that's not going to give me the answer I want. But I think that's
Yeah.
important. And then I love doing this, and this drives people, and I'll get your thoughts on this, Jeff, but testing boundaries on topics. And I can't tell
Mm.
you how many times I'm in a discussion with either with teams I'm working with, or and even currently, and we'll take a topic, and I pretty much know where I want to be. Like, I think this is the answers right here, but I'll start pulling the extremes. Well, what if we just shut down, or what if we just did this? And then I've actually had to learn to kind of adapt to. I'm actually testing our boundaries here because I'm trying to see what the reaction points are in the extremes, because we know the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? It's
Mhm.
very rarely one extreme of the topic, but I think you got to understand what are some of the extreme, what are the boundaries that exist for this decision? What's kind of the reaction there? Because from there could come some of the ideas or understanding, or maybe belief that you may be able to
Yeah.
shift more to one side or the other.
Do you find though that if you try to define boundaries that it may limit the thinking?
I think that's part of it too. Is what are the boundaries too? Because I think to your point, that's a great point, Jeff. I think people don't sometimes understand what the boundaries are. So if you're testing it, I'm like, you at least understand how extreme you are. And to me, it's about pulling your
Yeah.
thinking outside of the obvious and being that I love me, Jeff, I love being a contradiction and being a contrarian. And again, this is where usually I getting myself into trouble because people believe that they think the flip of it, he thinks we should shut down the place. No, I'm not
Right.
saying that, but I want to try to test his boundaries. But I think that's a great point, Jeff, is that I think by testing boundaries you even figure out if you have a boundary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then and then finally, I'd say avoid acting on the easy and obvious, but you do have to act and
Right.
understanding that we need to, you need to set your process and boundaries. And so I think if you do some of those things, it kind of creates that confusion tolerant mindset. Look, not everybody's going to be, I'm, it drives my wife nuts sometimes. Like, where do you want to go to eat? I don't know. We'll figure it out, and sometimes it's
Just
not
start
like
driving. Is that what you say? Let's just get in the car.
let's just get in the car or something. Although it's funny, I could be actually the biggest planner. My wife will say I could be the biggest planner as well too when we travel. I'm like hyper planned
Are
on
you?
that. But I think that there's people who are going to be natural kind of
Mm-hmm.
contrarians. But I think for every leader, they could figure out a way to figure out how to expand their kind of tolerance for
You
confusion.
know, this is interesting. A point that you just made. I did a podcast episode recently with my old advisory board members
Mm,
from Spun Logic, and it was great to chat with them. But I think I mentioned it on the podcast. But I remember when I was putting that together way back, the advice I got from one of them was, "Hey, as you put together an advisory board specifically, do not put an attorney in
mm,
that group. Attorneys are super important, right? And maybe
yeah,
should be on your board. But in terms of when you're trying to think creatively, they're in the room to protect you.
right.
And so thinking about boundaries, they're putting, like some people are, that's the role you want for them. You want to get the, but there's a time and a place for that. And so almost on the flip side, you got to make sure you don't have people that are putting the boundaries real close together and saying, all right,
Yeah.
this is our window to innovate, because that doesn't work either. The other thing what was the first point that you made?
About getting comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah. So one of the sort of themes that I like is that if you're not failing, you're being driven by a desire not to fail, and
Hmm.
therefore you're being cautious, and you're never going to, it's that idea of if you're not uncomfortable at times, then you're being driven by a need to be comfortable to make things safe. And
Right.
maybe there's some ways you can have success doing that, but you're really not going to you're not going to see anything exponential. You're not going to you're not going to really see around corners, and innovation, I think, is got to be impossible. So I love the uncomfortability.
Yeah, and it's human nature not to be right. You don't want to because it creates anxiety, and But I've had great kind of advisor earlier in my career said, look, if you feel like you're not going to puke, when you're making that decision, you're probably not going to make the right decision, particularly in something that's strategic or you're trying to differentiate or do something unique.
Yeah.
And that's part. But at the end of the day, I think we keep going back in many conversations. Leadership is about risk taking, and your tolerance for risk taking as well too. But by the way, sometimes having that lawyer and getting the right lawyer or accountant or whatever, which I know we just villainize just the two professions here, but I think something getting someone who understands that process is good too, because sometimes to kind of counteract that aspect of sometimes you're just expanding and you don't have stop is having someone to kind of create that
Mhm.
obstacle is sometimes good. Not maybe an obstacle, but a boundary, because then you could innovate or create around that boundary as well too. So
Yeah.
kind of could work a couple dimensions. But so good, Jeff. So hopefully we'll get you confused here, and we'll keep as we start building our content platform. But
Yeah.
I think it's I think it's an essential leadership trait, and hopefully as people listen here, they start, I'd encourage them to start thinking about their own aspects of, are they constantly, are they pushing their boundaries in terms of how they think? Are they comfortable being uncomfortable? And I think the biggest thing is, are you always deciding on the obvious? Then I take it outside. Is your competition
Mm.
easily able to arrive at the decision you are? And that's because at the end of the day, when you compete, it's about being unique and differentiating. So I think that's where some of that comes in. And you could even talk about within your own career. Are you doing things that's pretty obvious, or you did making some career moves that differentiate you as well?
Yep, no doubt.
So good, Jeff. Well, that was. I always enjoyed the discussion here, and I'm sure we'll be having some more great conversations and some more great guests as well. And we'll test some of these concepts with them. Maybe we'll give everybody a confusion test before they come on the show.
Yeah, we ought to.
And we'll
I
never
look,
get them
I don't
finished.
think I've heard the term confusion tolerance. So I learned something this morning.
Well, we'll put the link in the blog. I'll just, it'll definitely a big part of the writing, but we'll keep talking more about it as well too. So Jeff, let's enjoy this week, and we have a big week coming up here, of course, and so I think both of us want to encourage everybody to make sure they get out and vote if they haven't done so already. And thanks everybody for listening and watching the Jeff and Alex podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube, and most importantly, possibly on both, and to interact both with Jeff and I on social media. And let's keep the conversation going. So thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. We'll
And
see you next time.
See you all next week.